right, so we are here this evening for the next hour to do something a little bit different. Hold on a second. Here we go. That should work better. Okay. So we're here this evening to do something a little bit different than the usual. So all this month I've been talking about NASA's hunt for signs of life in the universe, both in our solar system and in exoplanets. And last month was doing explore flight, and we typically in these EPDC webinars we cover different NASA projects and the really cool and innovative stuff that is being done by the NASA scientists and engineers. But a lot of times we don't kind of pull the curtain back and kind of ask ourselves, but how are the NASA scientists and engineers doing this? And so this evening, what I'm hoping to do is kind of walk you through some of the thought patterns, some of the critical thinking and creative thinking that is at the heart of what we do here at NASA, and in some ways is at the heart of being human and stuff like that. And as we kind of go along here, hopefully you'll understand where I'm coming with that particular sentiment. So we're gonna talk a little bit more sort of on the STEM instructional practices, pedagogy side of the fence this evening. So as always, in front of you is sort of a roadmap for where we're going to go today. Going to talk a little bit, I'm going to run through a demonstration with you. It's meant to be interactive, so get ready to type in the chat box, which is your way of communicating with me. And in addition to interacting with me throughout the demonstration that I'm going to do here shortly, it's also a place for you to ask questions. And certainly this type of a program which takes a look at how we think, human beings think and problem solve, may generate a lot of questions for you. So chat box is a way for you to communicate those questions with me. If I somehow manage to miss a question as we go along, please don't be offended. I will stick around for a few minutes. We do have a 7:30 webinar, I believe, this evening. And so I will stick around for a couple minutes in between the end of this program and the start, I think, of the 7:30 program. Chat box is also a way for you to let me know that you are here. That is usually done by dropping an email in the chat box. Many of you have been on a previous webinar and know that I make my slide deck available to you. So that usually comes to you in the form of a resource email. So as you're dropping your email in the chat box, if you would like the resource email, please put a little notation next to your email to let me know that you would like the resources for this particular program. And if you're not comfortable putting it in the general chat box, you can always send it to me via a private tab in the chat box. Just hover over my name and just send me a private message. The email, in terms of attendance, this is a professional development opportunity for K-12 teachers here in the United States. And so I'll be taking attendance and entering you as being present here for the program in our system, which will generate a series of additional emails separate from the resource email. So sometime within the next 24 hours, you'll get an email that has a link for something we call a post-event quality survey. It's about 5 minutes, 10 questions. It's a way for you to give us feedback on what you do and do not like about a particular webinar. So please feel free to fill that out. It is actually required for the follow-up email. So if you would like a little certificate saying that you've done professional development or just an event with NASA, make sure that you fill out that survey. I give you about a week to do that, although with the holiday coming up next week, certainly the United States teachers, you may want to get it done sooner as opposed to later in that week. But a week from this evening, which will be Thanksgiving here in the United States, will be when the certificates get sent out. So you must fill out the survey to get the follow-up certificate of attendance. It does document that you got professional development backed up by Texas State University's College of Education, which is the home of NASA STEM EPDC. So it is backed up. And Lowell, you'll be able to show that to your district that yes, you did get professional development this evening. And that brings me to a point there's not really a lot of technical, scientific, or engineering that I'm going to talk about this evening, although I will use an engineering problem and kind of use that to kind of illustrate some of the things that are at the heart of critical and creative thinking here at NASA. But it's really not designed as a technical talk. It's designed as a professional development, instructional design, instructional skills type of a webinar. So just kind of upfront with that, if you were expecting any kind of scientific, technical knowledge from a particular NASA project this evening, that's not the intent this evening. And so with that, what I want to do is move next to the next slide. Most of you I recognize, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Ann Weiss. I am the education specialist based at NASA's Langley Research Center in the Office of STEM Engagement. I am originally trained as a research scientist, and that provides a rather interesting perspective on this particular talk this evening, because throughout my research training, that was how I was kind of apprenticed and got to practice the skills that are at the heart of the scientific and engineering process. And I was fortunate enough, I was doing my master's degree at Arizona State University in neuroscience, neuroendocrinology, taking a look at brain chemistry of depression in animal models. But one of the things that we would do was we would have a journal club, and in that journal club each week we would get together, we would read an article from the peer-reviewed literature. Part of it was for us to get familiar with the types of research that were going on in that particular field at that particular time. But the other purpose of it was to take a look at the process, the materials, the methods, how the science was done. And we would pick it apart. We would basically be, asking, was this a good study from a materials and methodology perspective? And so that really kind of informs what I'm sharing with you this evening. I was also graduate assistant for a non-majors biology course, and at the time I did not realize how important that would necessarily become, because we had in this non-majors biology class, we had people who wanted to be educators, wanted to go into business, basically non-STEM majors, and this was simply for them to check a box as they were completing their major degree requirements. And so for the most part, most of them had little interest in science. Most of them, I would say, it was borderline hate relationship with science, and it was biology was, of the three, the one that attracted the most non-STEM majors. And so we designed the course in a way that it promoted the creative and critical thinking skills that are at the heart of the scientific method. We figured that that would be more useful to the students in their careers and in their lives once they graduated than any sort of facts about cell cycle or DNA or those sorts of things, physiology. And so that's really kind of what informs this evening's talk. And it was really a pivot point for me in terms of education. I had been raised in the memorization and then regurgitated on a test type of a pedagogy. And so not only was I learning this new approach to teaching science, but I was also teaching it at the same point. And so that was really kind of the pivot point. I really loved how we presented the scientific method and critical thinking to these students. And by the end of the semester, some of them, not all of them, came to love science because it was the first time that they really had gotten an opportunity to see how science might actually help them in their lives. And so we considered that a win. I even had one student who, he was a business major, but he kind of tweaked his major so that he had a minor in science and he wanted to work for like a pharmaceutical or a scientific research company. So we felt good at the end of the semester if we were able to get the students from that sort of borderline hate relationship to science to, okay, I can see where this would be really helpful for me to know the basics of critical thinking. And so that's where we're going to start this evening. So what I want to do is I want to start out with a demonstration. So I'm going to bring up, or actually I'm going to expand my camera here. All right, and hopefully it will cooperate. It doesn't always cooperate sometimes, so I may have to do it. Come on. Of course it doesn't want to cooperate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to minimize my slides just a little bit and see if I can get it to cooperate that way. All right. Okay, so I'm full screen now, and I'm going to pull over a little SharePod here because this is where you're going to help me out here. Okay. All right. So how might these critical and thinking skills that we use at NASA, how might you actually be experiencing this in your everyday life? And it probably is really helpful if I pull the pod over a little bit so I'm actually able to see this. Okay, and of course I just lost my SharePod. Okay, all right. So most, if not all of us, have some kind of a light, flashlight, okay? And so if I go ahead and I click on the button here, all right, what should happen? You want to drop in the chat box there. Okay, so what should happen, what we're expecting to happen, is that the light should go on. So if I click the button here, okay, nothing happens. Happens from time to time, okay? So when we start out in terms of problem solving, and what I want you to do as we're kind of going along here is kind of think about how we go through the problem solving skills or the set of questions that we ask ourselves. So then we would come and say, okay, the light was supposed to turn on. Anne has pressed the button. Nothing has happened, okay? So what we have now is what we call puzzling observation in sort of the technical terms, okay? And so already people are starting to do that problem solving. They're coming up with what we have hypotheses. So what I'm going to do here in the SharePod is kind of make it a little bit bigger here, okay? Say light doesn't come on, okay? And most of you, because this is a routine problem, and you'll understand why I'm using that terminology here, have kind of skipped over the question, okay? Why is the light not coming on, okay? And this is why I was asking you to make sure you kind of pay attention to how you're problem solving here. Some of you have already put in the chat box a hypothesis, okay? So when we talk about the scientific method, we talk about a hypothesis, a possible answer to our question that may or may not be what's actually happening, okay? So we've got, okay, y'all with me here, check battery, check the light, okay? And, okay, so the battery could be damaged in some way. It could be dead. Doesn't have any more juice in it, okay? Damaged switch, okay? So things that are connected to the light switch itself, okay? Maybe there's a bad connection between the switch and the wires, okay? Possibly, okay? All right. Check wires, okay? All right, an example of steps in the scientific method. That's exactly what I'm doing here, okay? So when we talk about scientific method, this is probably something that you have done hundreds, if not thousands of times in your lifespan. And the reason that I had you kind of think about, not only come up with suggestions on what might be causing the reason why the lamp didn't come on, was to kind of refresh the scientific method, but also to have you think about what has become second nature to you. Okay, you have done this enough times, either in your everyday life or in the classroom or in the lab, that this has become second nature to you, that it's just, okay, yeah, this is what, that's why I was pointing out that for most of you, there wasn't a question in the chat box, which is what we typically ask our students to do. We say, okay, come from the observation to go to the question, because we're trying to ingrain those steps of the scientific method, but we've done it so often that for us, the experts, it's second nature to us, and I want you to keep that in mind as we go along. We talk about creative and critical thinking here in the scientific method. Okay, so all of these hypotheses that you have given to me in the chat box are testable. We could actually run an experiment. We could make a prediction, say, okay, if I change the battery, okay, that's my experiment. My prediction would be, if the battery is in fact what the problem is, the prediction would be that by fixing the battery, the light should turn on. Okay, and that would be true for each and every one of those particular hypotheses. And what actually happened was just before the webinar, I actually turned one of the batteries around so that it wouldn't work. So in this case, the hypothesis that you came up with first was actually the one that if we actually do the experiment, I can change the batteries around here so I have the correct polarity, they'll actually, hopefully, come on. Okay, and in fact, there you go. Okay, so in this case, it just happened by random luck that the first hypothesis that was put into the chat box actually happened to be the one that, when we fixed the batteries, was actually the one that was true. But we know that the reason we come up with multiple hypotheses, and this is where the creativity piece comes in, the reason we come up with multiple hypotheses is if for some reason it wasn't the battery, we would then be able to go to the next step. And of course, I'm kind of glossing over the idea of independent and dependent variables and the fact of a controlled experiment and just change one variable at a time until we figure out what the hypothesis actually that's supported actually is. Okay, so I use a relatively simple example. This is what we did with our non-major students because this was something that they readily could latch on to. It'd be like, oh yeah, I've done these sorts of things plenty of times. Okay, so let's do this with a slightly different scenario. Okay, because there's a point that I want to make about the testable. Okay, so here's my friend. All right, this is mascot from my school, Mr. Nittany Lion. Okay, and you'll notice he has a little sign here. Okay, it says, squeeze my hand. And so I typically would do this with my high school and my middle school students because they get more of a kick out of this than just the battery. But same type of thing, I would go ahead and I would squeeze the hand, and of course, Mr. Nittany Lion, or Miss Nittany Lion, however you want to see it, does not sing or play like the mascot should. Okay, and because it's a toy, we can come up with some of the same hypotheses. So why has Anne pulled this and not just stuck with the flashlight? Well, let us say for the sake of argument, okay, let me go ahead and put underneath here the second puzzling observation. Toy does not play. Okay, and so then I can tweak the question here. Why does the light, toy, not coming on? Okay, and many of these hypotheses would still be valid. Okay, but let's say for sake of argument in the case of Mr. or Miss Nittany Lion, I said that lion is depressed, i.e. doesn't feel like singing and dancing. Okay, now almost all of us are probably going to go, yeah, right. Okay, sure. It's a toy. It's not supposed to be, animated. It doesn't have feelings. We're putting human emotions onto the toy. Okay, but for our younger children, particularly the elementary students, they are very creative. They live in a make-believe world, and for some of them, this is a real person. Okay, and so that type of a hypothesis, particularly for our elementary students, and some middle school students, as I found when I would do this with them, is it's important then to reinforce for them that science does not necessarily apply to all questions. Engineering does not necessarily apply to all questions. There's certainly some things that are simply not testable by science. And it is a great thing to kind of refresh with students to make sure that they understand that while science is very powerful, engineering is very powerful, there are limitations to that, and not everything is testable. We don't want everything to be testable by the scientific method anyway. Questions of faith or, why are we here, existential questions like that and stuff like that, those are simply beyond the point of, or the boundaries of science. But it's a way to help by using a toy or something like this and talking about these sort of non-testable hypotheses, we're able to show students, okay, when you design your experiments and you have your hypotheses, you want to make sure that they're testable. And so those types of things help to reinforce the types of skills that we want our students to be developing when we talk about creative and critical thinking. All right, so I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box. If anybody has any comments or questions about the demonstration, go ahead and feel free to put those in the chat box. But let me go ahead and go back to my slides and let's talk a little bit about the thought process. And there was a reason why I wanted you to think about the process as you were problem solving. And I pointed out that, you know, we're experts. We've done this in the classroom number of times. We've probably done it in the lab numbers of times if we're researchers. And so for us, that's not necessarily going to be super helpful because for many of us, it's been a while since we were students. Okay, and so let me go to my next slide here. Okay, and so what we want to do is we want to kind of think about where are our students at. Okay, we would like to get them from novice, okay, to more of an expert. And so I've kind of put this little graphic towards the bottom here and stuff like that. And so during this demonstration, I asked you to think about, okay, from a problem solving standpoint, not the problem itself, what were you thinking as the demonstration unfolded? Okay, and you may have been thinking quite a lot of things like, okay, yes, it's very basic, it's very elementary. Why is Ann doing this and stuff like that. But what I really wanted you to focus on was the fact that you as an expert have done this so many times that it's become second nature. And the reason I pull that up is because I was mentoring a doctoral student a couple of years ago, and we were working on a qualitative research design for him for one of his classes, and I was asking him some questions, and he was a little bit stumped, so I was kind of helping him through and kind of putting pieces together. And at one point, he stopped me, and he's like, "How do you do that?" And I kind of shook my head, and I was like, "What do you mean, how do I do that?" He's like, "How are you putting these pieces together?" And the thing was I was just doing it. I wasn't even thinking about it. It's like driving home. You drive from, from school to home so many times it becomes automatic. You don't think about it. And he's like, "Can you please show me how you're doing? Can you please tell me what's going on up in your head as you're putting these pieces together?" And it was one of the harder things that I've had to do because, when it becomes second nature, it becomes very difficult to stop yourself and go, well, this is why I have this critical thinking skill, or this is why I'm thinking in this way in terms of creativity. And so that highlights something that I want to kind of point out for you, particularly for our students, in terms of trying to increase their ability to do these creative and critical thinking skills is something called metacognition. In education world, it's simply the ability to basically kind of step outside of yourself and look at your thought process and go, okay, I've done that well, or I've done this, and but I could still make improvements here. I don't know this. Maybe I should go read a book or something like that. And in terms of learning these creative and critical thinking skills, to make the transition from sort of the novice, our students, to the expert, and to like the spectacular things that we see with NASA, there's really that need to develop that metacognition skill, that ability to look back on yourself in sort of a self-reflective way, to understand what you've done well, what you need to improve upon, and be able to then troubleshoot and know where to go to find the resources to help you improve in that. We think of it sometimes as self-regulated learning and stuff like that. And so what I want to do right now before I go to the next slide is invite you to drop in the chat box some other areas in your life, in your everyday life, where you, your children, your students, your friends, just people might be doing problem solving, might need these skills. So go ahead and drop in the chat box some ideas while I move on to the next slide here, some ideas of where you might use problem solving skills in your everyday life. certainly in the classroom is a great example of problem solving, whether it is the smart board not connecting to the computer, which was a frequent issue in my classroom, or something with the iPads, the computers, the laptops we're having with our students. Exactly. You're problem solving, trying to figure out what is going on with classroom technology. So excellent, Michelle. Yes. Decision to carry out, let's see, umbrella. So yes, taking a look outside and going, weather forecast tells me this, clouds looking like that. Do I take it? Yes or no? So yeah, that would be a perfect example. Liliana is saying household appliances that may stop working, finding your way if you're lost, emergency preparedness procedures. Absolutely. Other examples, let's see if there's any other examples that people are dropping in the chat box. If you are new parents, for example, and the baby starts crying, baby is not going to be able to tell you what is wrong. And so you're going to be problem solving. You're going to try to figure out, is the baby hungry? Is the baby's diaper needs to be changed? Does the baby need to be burped? So things like childcare can be problem solving. Let's see, improve students' ability to understand. So yes, an example that I used when I was working on my dissertation, I talk about math problems, okay? Math teachers have, for example, to teach students long division or multiplication or addition and subtraction. And in terms of a pedagogy standpoint, there are particular skills or tricks that the math teachers will use to help the students learn how to do addition, subtraction, long division, stuff like that. But what happens if a student doesn't get it right away? Okay, well, now the teacher has to problem solve and come up with alternative ways to help that student or multiple students figure out how to learn to do, let's say, long division. And I know, particularly here in the United States with the Common Core of math, that's a whole unique problem solving situation in and of itself. But this is science, so we'll stay away from Common Core math and stuff like that at this point. So, of course, in the United States here, we have a set of standards that we are asked to teach according to, because most cases in most of our states, our students are going to take tests at the end of the student. Let's see, anybody who has lost sound. Is anybody else having trouble hearing me? Just want to make sure. I've got my microphone on, but I want to make sure that everybody can hear me. I can hear just fine. Okay. Yeah, okay. All right. So, Awi, it may be just simply an issue with your connection or your speakers. Okay. All right. Okay. And so for us here in the United States, we have these standards. And of course, most of us teachers are going to be teaching the next generation science standards, which are the national standards or the Common Core. Some of us, like for those of us in Virginia, we have very specific standards. We don't teach NGSS. We teach standards of learning. But this is a little bit different than some other countries around the world. And one of the things I was able to do when I was actually a doctoral student was actually travel to the United Kingdom. We stopped in Wales, we stopped in Ireland, and we stopped in London, UK, Britain, and we got to observe ways of teaching in other schools. And it was very informative because the United States, unlike a lot of other countries, has a more decentralized system of education, and there goes Miss Ninja. Whereas a lot of countries have it more centralized, and so they have a bit more control. But the interesting thing, taking a look at different countries and the way that they instruct, is a lot of countries focus more on the problem-solving skills. Is my personal observation. Because we have these standards, because we have these end-of-course tests here in the United States, it's real difficult sometimes to teach the problem-solving skills when we're required to have our students pass the test. And I experienced this here in Virginia when I was teaching standards of learning for earth science. I had to have at least 70% of my students pass the end of course test here in Virginia. Otherwise that would reflect badly on me and would reflect badly on the school district. So a lot of the questions were, definition type questions, or in some cases analyze charts, but it wasn't really those problem solving, those critical thinking skills that are at the heart of the scientific method and the engineering design process. So for those of us here in the United States, we have a bit of a tension here between what we're asked to teach in terms of accountability and standards and what actually happens in real world science and real world engineering. Other countries do a more extensive job of teaching problem-based skills from the get-go, from the elementary grades and stuff like that. So it's real interesting to see how different countries treat problem-solving skills and critical thinking skills. Agree that the problem is mathematical. Exactly. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to share with you some insights on the nature of science and the engineering design process. And one of the people that's really good about talking about the nature of science is Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson. And he has, from one of his videos, this quote that I've put up here that I think is really great when we talk about real world science and how can we teach that, particularly in the United States classrooms, when we have to teach to a test. And the idea here is not necessarily teaching by authority. What we want to do in science is we want to teach people how to think, not necessarily what to think, but how to think. That if by the time they graduate high school here in the United States, that they don't necessarily have well-developed critical thinking or creative thinking or problem-solving skills, the system has, in a way, kind of let them down a little bit because they're thinking that it has to come from a book, or it has to come from an internet site, or it has to come from, some person. It's saying, okay, this is what it is. And I think we can see in some of the situations that are happening right now in our world how teaching from authority might be a problem, where if we had more emphasis on developing the problem-solving skills, the critical thinking skills, we might, as a global society, be in a slightly different place than where we are right now and in some of our countries. So what I want to do is I want to play. I don't necessarily always promote a particular product or book or something like that, but this particular ad for Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson's masterclass is really good at kind of highlighting some of the things that would be really kind of helpful for citizens of a global society to have in terms of problem-solving skills as a basic. And of course, this is sort of the foundation of critical thinking and creative thinking here at NASA.
One of the great challenges in this world is knowing enough about a subject to think you're right, but not enough about the subject to know you're wrong. There's like a gazillion hours of me on the internet. In almost every case, I'm talking about the universe, black holes, the Big Bang, time travel, God. But what I'm gonna do in this masterclass is teach you how to think. The goal here is to train your mind how to see the world differently, how to question what others say. I've come to realize that there are three categories of truth: personal truth, political truths, and the objective truths that shape our understanding of the universe. The interesting thing about an objective truth is that it's true no matter what. Imagine that. By the time we're done, you will be equipped with some of the methods and tools so you can turn data into information, information into knowledge, knowledge into wisdom. We all have susceptibility to bias. Search engines on the internet are the epitome of confirmation bias. And you're going to use that as evidence that you are correct? No. The good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it. What does it mean to be skeptical? What does it mean to be convinced by data? A proper skeptic questions what they're unsure of, but recognizes when valid evidence is presented to change their mind. I will equip you to not only find objective truths, but then communicate to others how to get there. It's not good enough to be right. You also have to be effective. The less connected you are to what is objectively true, the less likely you will be able to make decisions that will benefit your life, the life of your family, and even civilization itself. I'm Neil deGrasse Tyson, and this is my master class.
Okay, so I like that, as I said, because it gives a nice overview of the types of skills that would be helpful to have in our students and as members of a global society. And when we talk about science or the engineering design process and stuff like that, you'll hear critical or critique or skeptic. And so one of the things that is, I guess, for some people, unsettling about science is the questioning aspect. The fact that scientists are like, show me the data. Okay, it is not just because you said it, that whole authority figure thing. It's not just because you said it that I'm going to accept it. I want to see the data that you have based that decision on so that I can evaluate the data and I can decide whether or not that data does truly fit what you're telling me. And so when we teach science and we teach the scientific method and we teach these critical and creative thinking skills, one of the things that's most difficult that I have observed, this is a personal observation that I have observed in teaching science, is a lot of times my students, by the time they get to middle school, have lost their voice. And what I mean by that is they're afraid to question. They're afraid to speak up and say why. Why is it that way? They've kind of gotten into this habit of, okay, well, the teacher said so, so I guess therefore it must be true. And so by the time we get to middle school, it's really hard to break that habit. Now, of course, we all have those students in our classroom who are like, no problem questioning what it is the teacher is saying and what the teacher is doing. But by and large, from my personal experience, the vast majority of my students were a little quiet. In fact, when I was teaching the non-majors course in biology, like the first 2 or 3 classes out of a 16-week course, it was like pulling teeth trying to get them to answer my questions. And so that creates sort of an awkward situation for the teacher, because the whole idea of teaching critical and creative thinking skills is not to give the answers to the students. So there would be times where I would have to be in front of the classroom and I have to be quiet. And that was the only way to actually force them to actually start speaking up and start interacting with me and practicing those skills. Until they actually started speaking and asking me questions, they weren't really practicing the skills. And if you're not practicing the skills, you're not going to get better at the critical and creative thinking skills. And so how can we do this in terms of activities, particularly for those of us here in the United States, where we have those standards that we have to hit? So the good folks at JPL, and I know I hit this again and again, the good folks at JPL Education have a lot of resources that are aligned to standards, but they also include problem-based learning or situations, engineering design challenges where even the teacher may not know really the right answer. And so it ends up being sort of this collaborative experience where the students and the teachers work together to figure out the answers. And so I've talked about this instructional resource before, so I won't talk too much about it, but this one helps to kind of reinforce those developing a hypothesis and then testing hypothesis skills that we want our students to gather. And of course, since I've been talking about NASA's Hunt for Signs of Life, I figured this was a good one to add in because it has the astrobiology, it's aligned to NGSS standards and things like that. And so as I've mentioned in previous webinars, we here at EPDC do have some quick bit videos that show you in more detail how to actually run the experiments. So if you're interested, we do have English and Spanish versions. You can watch these videos and learn more about a particular NASA activity that you can do with your students in your classroom, and basically how to do it. One with the specialists, there's 11 of us, we work together to work through and show you how to do a particular NASA activity. So I'm not going to take the time to do that, but I do want to point out this particular resource because it's really good in terms of teaching the scientific method and helping students reinforce those skills. So let's talk about engineering for a little bit here really quickly. For those of you outside of the United States, you may or may not be familiar with this particular report. My original dissertation advisor was actually working on some research with the National Academies of Engineering, and so this is how I'm aware of this particular report. But back in 2004, the National Academy of Engineering here in the United States got together and they had a conversation where they basically did a thought experiment, and they asked themselves, okay, in about 20 years from now, what are the engineers and what types of skills are those engineers going to need to do to be effective as engineers in their careers? And what you see there on the screen there in front of you is a list of the skills that they came up with. And the thing that I want to point out here, the first couple of ones are kind of standard fare for engineering, but what I want to point out is some of the ones lower down on the list, and that's not because they're lower in priority, just happens to be that's how they ended up getting on the screen. Lifelong learner, and that's something you're going to see with the NASA scientists and engineers, is once we graduated from college or our graduate program, we didn't stop learning. We kept asking questions, we kept reading, we kept getting that information. Something that we talk about here at EPDC is being able to put ourselves in other people's shoes. So the Academies of Engineering recognize that the problems that future engineers would be solving would probably be global in scale, things like sea level rise, for example, or bringing clean water and electricity to places around the world that may not necessarily have those kind of amenities that those of us other places in the world have. And so being able to recognize differences between societies and cultures and being able to incorporate that into engineering solutions was another one of those skills that was recognized that the future engineers might want to have. And then this ability to integrate information, and this is not just within between chemical engineering and mechanical engineering. This would be engineering and, say, the humanities or social studies or languages or math or things that might be closely related to engineering, and then things that might be further apart, arts and humanities, for example, and stuff like that. But the ability to integrate the information was another skill that we would want to recognize the National Academies would want to have, they thought, in the engineers of tomorrow. And so this brings me to the engineering design process, which in some ways is similar to the scientific method. And if you talk to any NASA engineers, they're not necessarily going to follow it step by step, just like you did not follow the scientific method step by step when we were doing the flashlight problem. But as Neil deGrasse Tyson talked about, one of the most important things that an engineer needs to be able to do if they have an idea is to be able to communicate it not only to other members of his or her team, but also outside of the engineering world. So if they're going into a village and saying we're going to put in pipes and plumbing and such that you can have running water, be able to communicate with the villagers to be able to get them get their buy-in to that particular project. So for sake of time, I'm going to skip over this particular video, which is just simply showing different types of engineering problems, to bringing you to this, to kind of show you that no matter what subject we're talking about, and of course in terms of education we split subjects because it makes it easier for us to teach to our students, but the process by which we create a piece of creative writing or a piece of artwork, or we solve a math problem, or as you saw in engineering and science, the process is very similar. And so when I started this program, I said at some levels, creative and critical thinking is at the heart of being human, because we're problem solving. If you go back tens of thousands of years and people are like, okay, I got to figure out how to stay warm, they're problem solving. Just like in today's world, okay, I need to figure out why my car is not working so I can make sure I can get to my job. That's a problem solving skill. So the problems may be different from what our predecessors might have been solving tens of thousands of years ago, but the process is still pretty much the same. And so the engineering video that I show that I kind of skipped over says to engineer is to human. To do science is to be human, to ask questions, to be curious about the world around us, and then try to solve problems is in the very fabric of our species as human beings. And so if you take a sort of compare and contrast sort of thing, you get sort of similarities. So how does this all work at NASA? Okay, and these are all skills. And so when we talk about critical and creative thinking at NASA, what you're essentially doing is taking experts at the creative and critical thinking skills who have just over the course of their lifetime practiced and practiced and practiced from where they started as novices. And so all these skills and all these things I've kind of been talking about the first 45 minutes of the program are literally at the foundation of the stuff that we do here at NASA. And one of the things I want to point out before we all sign off for this evening is this idea of success. And a lot of times when I talk to people at NASA, and then I talk to people outside of NASA, there's really sort of a disconnect between what people in the general public think happens at NASA and what actually really happens at NASA. And I think this particular slide kind of sums it up really, really well. There's 10 NASA field centers, and if you take a real close look at the names of them, you will notice that there's a difference. Some of them, like Langley Research Center or Armstrong Flight Research Center, have the word research in there. And the reason I have that in there is that's where we come up with the creative ideas. We have no idea if they're actually going to work in practice, but this is where we brainstorm all of those different hypotheses or all those different solutions, and then we play around with them. And failure is a part of our life. A lot of times people are like, I don't want to get the wrong answer. I don't want to fail. And you know, when we talk to teachers who might be doing engineering design challenges for the first time in their classroom, they're really worried about the right answer. And what I'd like to try to do, what I always try to do with these types of events when I talk about this type of thing, is NASA scientists fail all the time. The only thing is we usually do it on our centers, and by the time you actually see the finished project, which has gone through tens of thousands of tests in a wind tunnel or tens of thousands of redesigns on the computer, by the time you actually see it, we've gotten it to the point, we've engineered it to the point where failure has been basically run out of the equation, to now where we have places like Kennedy Space Center where we're launching the astronauts, or Johnson Space Center where we're training the astronauts, or we're mission control, we're watching over the astronauts while they're up on the International Space Station. Obviously, in a launch situation or having the astronauts in orbit, failure really isn't an option. We don't want that on the table. So how do we get there? It's by all the tens of thousands of hours that the general public doesn't see in the wind tunnels and the research facilities around the country. And so I've got two pictures here. One's from Hidden Figures on the left. That's the movie about the human computers here at NASA Langley Research Center. And they actually show you scenes where we had the Mercury capsule in the wind tunnel and the heat shield was failing. It was blown off and being blown off by the wind turbines. That's okay for it to be failing there in the wind tunnel. We want it to fail in there. In fact, a lot of times part of the NASA engineer's job is to push something to its breaking point, its failure point, so that we know where it fails and we can design ways to improve the ability of that vehicle or that object to go past what was its original failure point. So failing forward is sort of the unofficial tagline of our research centers. We want to break stuff. We want stuff to fail. We want to understand why it's doing that so that we can reinforce it, redesign it, and make it better so that by the time we ship it off to Johnson Center, Space Center, or Kennedy Space Center, it's not going to fail for the purposes. Another example I like to use is the satellites that we put up into orbit. So things like Cassini to Saturn or Juno to Jupiter, which some of my colleagues will talk about next week. We design redundancies in there. So we don't send it up there with just one computer or one version of a spectrometer or anything like that. We put redundancies in so we have 2 or 3 versions. And so a lot of times when we announce the mission to the general public, we say, okay, the mission's been designed for X amount of time. But what we really have done behind the scenes is we've engineered it for a wide period of time, which is much longer. So to give you sort of an example, concrete example, the Ingenuity drone that went up with Perseverance to Mars. The original flight plan was for 4 flights. We put it down on the ground, play it, and the engineers out at Jet Propulsion Laboratory were basically going to push it until it failed. Well, after 4 missions, it did so spectacularly well because we had designed those redundancies in there that the craft hadn't failed. So it was like, okay, we can actually add on to the mission. And I think we just completed flight number 16 and stuff like that. So I want to make sure that before you leave today, I want you to understand that while we have this public persona of failure is not an option, thanks to the Apollo 13 movie and Gene Kranz and all that, and making sure the astronauts came back from that successful failure of a mission, there's actually a lot of failure that happens behind the scenes during the design process and stuff like that. So as you're doing engineering design challenges with your students in the classroom, it's more real life to let them design something, let it fall apart or break apart, and have them then go back and redesign it. That's more realistic of what actually happens at NASA than we get it right the first time. Okay. All right, so I've got about 9 minutes left here. What I'd like to do is I'd like to try and play this clip. If you're not familiar with the HBO series From the Earth to the Moon, it's narrated by Tom Hanks. It's a fabulous series, but there's an episode where they actually take you behind the scenes to show you how the lunar module was created. The episode is entitled Spider. And I love this because it's a great way, oops, wrong one. It's a great way that kind of takes you behind the scenes of what really happens with the engineering design process, of these failing forward moments that we have in terms of getting from an idea to the actual the actual machine. So here we go.
Sputnik, Wernher von Braun briefed the head of the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics. He presented the 2 best options for going to the moon.
Well, there are 2 methods. The first method we call direct ascent. You build an enormous rocket, put a capsule on top, boom, you go straight to the moon. The other method we call Earth Orbit Rendezvous. Instead of using one huge rocket, we perform several launches with somewhat smaller rockets, each carrying a component of the spacecraft. We put the pieces together in orbit, and off we go.
And these 2 methods, these are the only ways of getting to the moon?
Yes.
Actually, there were other ideas.
So we started thinking, what can we do right now? And then it hit us.
The moon! You rendezvous on the surface of the moon.
The problem isn't getting a man to the moon.
That's easy.
It's not easy.
Relatively easy.
Pretty easy. The problem is getting him back.
So we say, you send up some ships to the moon with all the extra fuel and supplies you need to get back. That way, when the astronauts arrive, everything they need to get home is already there.
We put a man on the moon as soon as possible.
Just get him there.
We can keep sending him supply ships
Until we figure a way to get him back.
Well, that's... No, I'm sorry, gentlemen. I'm sorry, but there is no way on God's green earth we would ever do anything like that. I'm sorry.
It looked like either Earth Orbit Rendezvous or direct ascent would be the way to go.
And either way we go, the spacecraft that lands on the moon is going to look like that.
Yes, just like that.
No, doesn't have to look like this at all.
At Chancevot Industries in Texas, an engineer named Tom Dolan hit upon an interesting idea.
You ever hear of a Russian rocket guy named Yuri Kondratyuk? Back in 1916, he realized something that we seem to have forgotten today. Getting to the moon is going to be all about weight. Look at the size of this thing. It's got to be 60, 70 feet tall, a couple of 100 tons at least. Do you really need to take all that to the surface? No. Well, Kondratyuk wondered, what I wonder is, What if you took along a smaller vehicle, lightweight, that you just used to land? Something like this.
But Tom, you could never re-enter the Earth atmosphere in that.
I know. You come back on the spacecraft you took from Earth.
But that means you'd have to have a rendezvous between the two of them in lunar orbit.
Exactly. Von Braun calls his method Earth orbit rendezvous. I call this lunar orbit rendezvous.
Tom, we don't even know if rendezvous is possible on Earth orbit. And you want to do it around the moon? But wouldn't that be kind of dangerous?
I don't know. Would it?
So I only have about 5 minutes left, and once again, I have way more information than I have time for. And the question is, are all the episodes available on YouTube? Not their full episodes. There are pieces of them on YouTube. I think you would have to log into the online version of HBO and be able to get the full episodes that way. So if you're part of your cable package or something like that. So that I like that clip for a number of reasons in terms of looking at the creative and critical thinking skills at NASA. It starts out with a very well-respected individual, Dr. Wernher von Braun, the creator of the V2 rocket, developer of the Saturn V rocket, etc., etc. Okay, and so a lot of people put a lot of weight on what he said in terms of these are the two ways. These are the only two ways that we're going to be able to get to the moon. Okay, and there's some strength to that. Obviously, he was an expert. He knew what he was talking about when it came to rockets and stuff like that. But there's also a challenge with that, because had there not been somebody going, hey, wait a second, I'm a bit skeptical of that, we might not have gotten lunar rendezvous. And the other thing that I like about this is, of course, we here sit with the benefit of hindsight, looking back 50 plus years to the Apollo program and going, oh wow, you know, boom, 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 voila, we have men on the moon. Okay, what has been lost in the 50 plus or so years is all of the starts and stops, all of the dead ends that went from the time that John F. Kennedy challenged us to go to the moon until we actually got there. And what's been lost is how many times we almost completely just said, you know what, forget it. We're just not going to do it, or we weren't able to come up. And so the challenge with having some expert be like, well, this is the way you've got to do it, is that sometimes it crowds out those other perspectives, those alternative hypotheses that might actually work. And so one of the strengths of NASA is the ability to welcome different perspectives, to say, you know what, we might not necessarily have all the answers. Maybe somebody outside of NASA has some ideas, and that's where we encourage looking beyond our area of expertise. And I'm not going to have time to really kind of tell the story of how, because I worked at Los Alamos National Lab, which is where the atomic bomb was created. Back in the late 20s, early 30s, we didn't know how to enrich uranium and plutonium. And Ernest Lawrence, who eventually was one of the leads, he was a talented young scientist. He had this habit of every Sunday evening after he had dinner with his wife, he'd wander back over to the college library and he would just start reading articles in particular journals. And frequently they were outside his particular area of expertise. And he stumbled upon this very obscure paper. I forget the actual journal. But the Europeans at that point had the lead in terms of quantum physics and atomic physics and all those sorts of things. So it was a paper out of Europe. And essentially what the paper was saying was, perhaps if we can use magnets to kind of speed up the atoms, we might be able to enrich the uranium in this way. And I'm oversimplifying it. But in that one obscure article lay the solution that Ernest Lawrence was able to parlay into a way that we actually were able to enrich uranium and plutonium and put us on the pathway to creating the atomic bomb and the era of atomic energy. And so my point in leaving you with that is NASA scientists are not just experts within their particular field. A lot of times we'll do reading outside of our particular area, and so we'll have these different things available to us that we can pull from and tie together into these solutions that are really kind of, to most people, off the wall, because they kind of pull pieces together. If you're interested in learning more about how human creativity works, you would want, perhaps, once again, I don't normally recommend books, but this was a book that we had to read for our professional development a couple of years ago. It is co-authored by a neuroscientist, so you can see why I would be favor of this, and a musician. A professor. So one is a professor of neuroscience, the other is professor of music. This was a New York Times bestseller here in the United States, and it basically goes through how human creativity comes together. And so it's wonderful because it blends the sort of the biology perspective of how our brains work with the creative sides of our brains, and how we kind of mix and match those to come up with potential solutions to problems that we're trying to solve. And in the book, it talks about 3 general strategies that humans use. Bending, which is simply looking at things in different lights. And I use an example of Monet's paintings. He had this apartment overlooking the cathedral, and at different times of the day he would paint it. And so he has this series of paintings where the cathedral looks different because he painted it at different times. That's what we mean by bending. Breaking is where you kind of take pieces apart and then put them together in new combinations. And so something from science like protein sequencing would be an example of that. And then blending, where you take 2 completely different things and you kind of put them together in some kind of a new solution, like the Sphinx. I've oversimplified the book. There's lots and lots and lots of examples from real world that kind of illustrate these 3 strategies that we humans appear to use in terms of problem solving and creatively solving those problems. I have a second link and sort of some discussion questions from there. But one of the best ways for students to become proficient at the critical and creative thinking skills that NASA scientists and engineers use is to actually get their hands dirty and do it. So I want to leave you with this particular instructional resource. It's actually a clearinghouse of design challenge contests, different sorts, it's basically different sorts of contests. And so going back to this idea that NASA scientists and engineers do not have this perspective that we have all the answers, that perhaps somebody outside of NASA might have a perspective that actually is the key to solving the problem, I direct you to this particular website. It's called NASA Solve. There's the link down in the bottom right corner there. It'll take you to tiles that'll give you examples of different design challenges and contests, some of which recur every year with different themes, and some of them are one-time things like app challenges, or we just finished a deep food space challenge where we invited K-12 students to come up with ways that we might feed our astronauts in a healthy manner when we send them to Mars. So these are real world problems that we are asking the public's help for in terms of solving. And these particular challenges or contests do have prizes. Sometimes they're cash prizes. Sometimes they're virtual talks with subject matter experts here at NASA. Sometimes they're actually on center. Come on center, and we take you around and show you different facilities on center and stuff like that. Obviously with COVID, that's a bit of a challenge right now, but this is a great way to get students involved in the real world science and engineering that we do here at NASA to help them practice those skills, and at the same point we get to benefit from these different perspectives. So it's really a wonderful symbiotic collaborative experience, which of course in the end science and engineering is a collaborative teamwork type of experience. Let me go ahead and flip to the end. So as you can see, you're going to get a whole bunch of extra goodies when you get the resource. Here is my email. If you have questions beyond the ones that I'm seeing in the chat box, which I'll circle back around to here in just a second, please feel free to send me an email. This is something that was the foundation of my dissertation and is at the heart of what I get to do here at NASA. So I love talking about this. So by all means, feel free to send me questions or comments. Post-event surveys will go out sometime in the next 24 hours for most of that. That'll be November 19th. And then the surveys, if you fill out, you will get that next week, Thursday, November 25th. As part of the resources, you will get the recording for this, so you'll be able to go back around and look at this in more detail. In the next week and a half, 2 weeks, obviously we will be off for the Thanksgiving holiday, but we will have some webinars in and around. During the program, I mentioned that my colleagues, one of them would be doing Cassini. That'll be Dr. Deepika Sangam next Monday. She will do an Explore Solar System and Beyond. That's what the SSB stands for, Solar System and Beyond. She will do a deep dive into Saturn and the Cassini mission. And then my colleague Latina Taylor, who's based out of Texas State, will go ahead and talk to you about Juno, which is a current mission. Obviously Cassini is complete, but Juno is ongoing, so she'll talk to you about Jupiter and the Juno mission. And then Design Challenge, once again, kind of getting the students involved, get their hands dirty, practice those skills. Dr. Vimitra White will run you through a BEST activity. That's K through 8 Engineering Design Challenge curriculum that you can implement in your classroom. She's going to do the activity about thermal protection, heat shields for spacecraft re-entering the atmosphere. And then let's see, that should have been Tuesday. Tuesday, November 30th, after we come back from the holiday, I will complete my NASA's Hunt for Signs of Life in the solar system with a take a look back and see how all of these things we're learning might tell us something about our home planet. So I will do that on Tuesday, not Thursday, Tuesday, November 30th at 6 p.m. As always, thank you so much for your time this evening, plus a few extra minutes. As always, as good teachers, we always have more information than we have time for. But Ms. Ninja and I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to join us, and stay safe. Wherever you are in the world, for those of you in the United States, happy Thanksgiving. And as I said, I will stick around for a couple moments. As I said, I think we have a 7:30 webinar, so I'll stick around for a couple minutes if you have questions. Okay? You're very, very welcome. Hopefully there was something in there for everybody. The big takeaway is you know, there's not much difference between our students and the NASA scientists and engineers. I think Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson basically put it best. Scientists and engineers are kids who never grew up. And what he means by that is they never lost their curiosity, they never lost their wonder, they never lost their ability to ask questions. And so if we can somehow promote that curiosity throughout our students' lives in the classroom and beyond, not all of them obviously will go into a STEM career, but they will have at least scientific literacy. And so the only difference between the students and the scientists and engineers is just practice, practice, practice in terms of practicing those problem-solving skills and those creative skills. Yes, failing forward. Yes, and for a lot of teachers, that's the light bulb that they need. Is like, oh wow, NASA scientists, engineers. You know, we have this big, huge thing. It's like, oh, you know, we do this, we do that. No, we fail quite a lot. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. And so by learning from our mistakes, I think I saw it one place. Fail stands actually for first attempt in landing. So if you don't succeed, if at first you don't succeed, try again. So like, you know, my dad was a pilot, and come in for a landing, doesn't look quite right, fire up the engines, go around, try it again, and stuff like that. So yeah, you know, a lot of times we think of failure as a negative type of thing, and here at NASA we don't really look at it as a negative sort of thing. It can be frustrating. We pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, you know, if something doesn't work quite the way we wanted it to, but we persevere, we get up, we dust ourselves off, we try again, we learn from those failures to move us forward as an agency, but then also as a species and as a society. So yeah, that's something that teachers really resonate with when we share that failing forward, that yeah, we're just more practiced at the engineering design process of the scientific method. It's not some unique superpower that we have, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Okay, let me scroll back around. I think there was at least one question, if not two, that I missed during the program. So I'll quick scoot back around and see what What? Okay, I got the episodes. Gateway is going to apply the varying lunar orbit in a refined way. Yes, yes, and that's the interesting. Thank you, Neville, for reminding me. Gateway is an interesting application of what we've learned with the International Space Station and Apollo. So in that book that I recommended, The Runaway Species, the blending, the breaking, and I forget what the third one is. But taking what we've learned, readapting it to a new situation. So when we went to the moon the first time, we pretty much were stuck with whatever orbit we had when we left Earth. Gateway is going to give us an opportunity to change orbits. That is a new capability that the Apollo astronauts didn't have. But Gateway is very much like a mini International Space Station. So all of the stuff we've been learning from the last 20 years from the International Space Station, we're going to get to apply that in terms of designing and operating Gateway in lunar orbit. So yeah, taking a little bit of the old, what we learned from Apollo and the International Space Station, and packaging it together in a new solution, which will be Gateway for the Artemis program. So yeah, that excellent point there, Neville. Okay, you're very welcome. Very, very welcome. Yeah, very welcome. This has kind of become my passion, and having started out as a physics major, and then switching to a biology major, and then switching to, there were a lot of things that I learned being a female in physical sciences, being in biological sciences as a researcher, but how to teach, I would say that non-majors biology course that I taught at Arizona State really redefined not only how I approached teaching, but also how I approached research. I played a video from Chris Hadfield, and for those of you who weren't necessarily with us right at the very beginning, it starts out by asking Chris, if you had the opportunity to talk to your 20-year-old self, what would you say? And of course he answers it. And I sit here now and be like, I wish that I could kind of go back and kind of talk to my 15-year-old self or my 18-year-old self or even my 20-year-old self, and kind of talk to her about, the nature of science. I was so busy memorizing. I remember my high school chemistry teacher, he had us memorize the elements of the periodic table, their atomic number, their weight. He was big in the memorization thing. And for me, at least, I was good at memorization. So I ended up doing okay in chemistry because I was good at the memorization. But being able to recite, atomic number or atomic weight of elements in the periodic table really doesn't help me in my job right now. It didn't really help me in the lab when I got to Arizona State and stuff like that. And so if I had the opportunity to kind of go back in time and talk to myself when I was 15 or 16 or 20, I would say, don't worry so much about the memorization, worry more about the process and how to think through problems. That'll be more helpful to you when you're in your career later on in life. Okay. Okay. You're very welcome. Very welcome. Okay. You're very welcome. I think I got all the questions, so you're very, very welcome. So. See, it's almost 7:15. I'll go ahead and stop the recording so I can buffer, but I'll stick around for a few more minutes. Miss Ninja's making the moves that it's getting to be time for Din Din. But I want to say thank you for your time and for joining us this evening, and hope that, this is helpful to you in your classroom or even in your everyday life. And Miss Ninja will say goodbye there.